Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere truly extraordinary. A place that existed not so very long ago, yet feels like another world entirely. We're going to San Francisco. But not the San Francisco of postcards and tourist brochures. No, we're going to the San Francisco of the 1970s, a city that was beautiful and brutal, revolutionary and terrifying all at once. Imagine for a moment. The summer of love has ended. The flower children who danced in Golden Gate Park have scattered to the winds. And what remains is something far more complicated than any history book will tell you. The painted Victorian houses still stand in rows like colourful sentinels, but behind their doors, stories are unfolding that will shake the nation to its core. In this one city during this one decade, you had everything. Serial killers sending coded messages to newspapers, daring them to catch him. A newspaper heiress kidnapped by revolutionaries, only to apparently join them. A charismatic preacher building a following of thousands, leading them towards something unspeakable. A neighbourhood transforming into a beacon of hope for an entire community of people who had been told their very existence was shameful. Rock and roll legends living in mansions, throwing parties that lasted for days, and through it all, the fog rolling in from the bay, as if trying to hide what was happening from the rest of the world. This is the story they don't teach you. The real story of what happened when the dream of the 1960s met the cold reality of the 1970s. It's a story of hope and horror, of revolution and tragedy, of people reaching for utopia and finding something very different instead. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you back. Back to a time when anything seemed possible in San Francisco, for better and for worse. Back to the streets where legends walked and monsters lurked. Back to the decade that would change America forever. Let's begin. To understand what San Francisco became in the 1970s, you first have to understand what it was leaving behind. And nothing captures that transformation quite like what happened to a little neighbourhood called Haight-Ashbury. If you had walked down Haight Street in the summer of 1967, you would have seen something remarkable. Young people everywhere, wearing flowers in their hair, colours so bright they almost hurt your eyes, music drifting from open windows, the smell of incense mixing with the salt air from the bay, free food being handed out in the parks, free medical care at a clinic that asked no questions, a genuine experiment in a different way of living. They called it the Summer of Love, and somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 young Americans descended on this compact neighbourhood of elegant Victorian houses searching for something they couldn't quite name. Freedom, perhaps. Meaning. A community that cared about people instead of money. They came because they believed, truly believed, that they could build a better world right here on these few city blocks. But here's what they don't tell you. By the time 1970 arrived, the Summer of Love was already a memory turning sour. The cameras had left. The national magazines had moved on to other stories. And what remained in Haight-Ashbury was something far darker than anyone had imagined possible. The residents who had been there from the beginning saw it coming. In October of 1967, just a few months after the Summer of Love's peak, they organised something called the Death of the Hippie ceremony. It was a mock funeral, a piece of street theatre complete with a coffin and mourners dressed in black. They walked through the streets of the Haight, carrying signs that read, "Hippie, son of media." The message was clear. Stay away. The party is over. What the newspapers created, the newspapers have killed. But people kept coming anyway. They came because they had heard the stories. They came because they had seen the magazine covers. They came searching for a dream that had already died, and what they found instead was a nightmare. By 1970, heroin had replaced LSD as the drug of choice in the Haight. The difference cannot be overstated. LSD, whatever its dangers, was a drug of expansion, of seeking. Heroin is a drug of escape, of disappearing. And people were disappearing into addiction, into the streets, into graves. The beautiful Victorian houses that had once been communes full of artists and musicians became flop houses and shooting galleries. Criminal gangs moved into the vacuum left by the idealists. The free love that had been celebrated became, in too many cases, a pretense for exploitation, and worse. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, which had been founded to help young people through bad acid trips, found itself treating infections from dirty needles and wounds from violent assaults. The crime statistics tell part of the story. Murder rates in the neighborhood soared, robbery became commonplace. The peace and love generation found itself living in a war zone. But statistics can only capture so much. What they can't capture is the feeling of walking down a street that had promised utopia and finding despair instead. And then there were the deaths that made national headlines. In October of 1970, within weeks of each other, two of the brightest stars of the San Francisco music scene died of drug overdoses. Janis Joplin, the Texas blues singer who had electrified audiences with Big Brother and the Holding Company, was found dead in a Hollywood hotel room, a victim of heroin. She was 27 years old. Just 18 days earlier, Jimi Hendrix had died in London, also from drugs. He was 27 as well. These deaths seemed to symbolize something larger. The incredible creative energy that had flowed through San Francisco in the 60s was being extinguished, one candle at a time. The music would continue, but the innocence was gone. Perhaps the most chilling detail of the Haights' decline is one that most people don't know. In the late 60s, freshly released from prison, a man named Charles Manson spent time in the Haight, recruiting followers. He was just one face in the crowd then, another bearded figure spouting philosophy about love and freedom. Some of the young people who joined him in those San Francisco days would later participate in the most infamous murders of the decade. Manson didn't create the darkness that consumed the Haight, but his presence there, in those final days of innocence, serves as a reminder of how thin the line is between idealism and madness, between seeking enlightenment and losing yourself entirely. The residents who had tried to warn everyone, who had staged that funeral for the hippie in '67, were proven right. But being right brought them no comfort. Their neighborhood, the place they had loved and tried to protect, was irrevocably changed. Many of them left, scattering across California, forming communes in rural areas, trying to recreate somewhere else what they had lost in the Haight. By the early 70s, walking down Haight Street was an exercise in melancholy. The psychedelic storefronts remained, their paint fading. The Victorian houses still stood, beautiful in their architecture but hollow in their souls. Young people still drifted through, but they had a different look in their eyes now, not hope, something closer to desperation. The summer of love lasted one season. The winter that followed would last for years. But here's the remarkable thing about San Francisco. Even as one dream was dying, others were being born. The creative energy didn't disappear. It transformed. It flowed into new neighborhoods, new movements, new ways of imagining what a city could be. The story of the Haights' decline is just the first chapter of the 1970s. What came next was even more extraordinary. While the streets of the Haight were struggling through their dark transformation, the music that had made San Francisco famous continued to evolve, and if you want to understand the soul of 1970s San Francisco, you have to understand its soundtrack. Let me take you to a house, not just any house, but perhaps the most legendary rock and roll residence in San Francisco history. 2400 Fulton Street, a magnificent Victorian mansion sitting right at the edge of Golden Gate Park. In 1968, Jefferson Airplane, already one of the biggest bands in America, bought this house and made it their headquarters. They promptly painted the exterior black and gold. Every band member's name was on the deed, and what happened within those walls became the stuff of legend. The mansion wasn't just a place to live, it was a culture center, a gathering place, a symbol of everything the San Francisco music scene represented. The parties at 2400 Fulton were epic. There's a famous story about Thanksgiving of 1968, when Owsley Stanley, the legendary audio engineer who was equally famous for being the first person to synthesize his own LSD, somehow obtained an advance copy of the Beatles' Hey Jude. He wired the entire house with speakers and played that song in every room, over and over all night long. Young fans, mostly teenage girls, would sit on the wall across the street, hoping for a glimpse of Grace Slick or Paul Kantner. Some of them would eventually work for the band, transitioning from groupies to secretaries to public relations staff. The boundaries between audience and artist were permeable in ways that seem impossible now. Just a few blocks away, another legendary band was making history. The Grateful Dead had emerged from the same Haight-Ashbury scene that produced Jefferson Airplane, but their trajectory was different. While the Airplane chased commercial success and radio hits, the Dead built something more unusual: a community. The Dead's concerts were never just concerts. They were events, gatherings, almost religious experiences for the devoted fans who called themselves Deadheads. The band would play for hours, their improvisational jams stretching songs into epic journeys. Their sound man, Owsley Stanley, the same Owsley from that Hey Jude party, designed the legendary Wall of Sound, a speaker system so massive and innovative that it changed what live music could be. In 1970, the Dead released 2 albums that captured the strange duality of the moment. Working Man's Dead and American Beauty were departures from their earlier psychedelic explorations. The songs were shorter, more structured, drawing on folk and country influences. The cover of Working Man's Dead was photographed in an industrial section of San Francisco, the band looking like labourers rather than rock stars. It was as if they were signalling a new era, a grounding after the flights of the 60s. The Dead loved Golden Gate Park, playing free concerts at various spots throughout the decade: Hippie Hill, the Polo Field, the Panhandle. These weren't commercial events. They were gifts to the community, a way of maintaining the spirit of free exchange that had defined the scene from the beginning. But the 70s also brought new bands to San Francisco stages. Santana, led by the virtuoso guitarist Carlos Santana, had emerged from the city's Latino community with a sound that fused rock with Latin rhythms. Their performance at Woodstock in 1969 had made them international stars, and throughout the 70s they continued to innovate and evolve. The Doobie Brothers formed in San Jose in 1970 and quickly became associated with the Northern California sound. Their harmonies and guitar work would define the soft rock movement of the decade. Journey, another Bay Area band, started as a progressive rock group before transforming into arena rock superstars. Tower of Power brought funk and soul to the mix, their horn section becoming one of the most recognizable sounds in popular music. Behind all of this music stood Bill Graham, the concert promoter who had transformed live rock performance into an art form. Graham had opened the Fillmore Auditorium in 1966, and after a brief closure, he reopened it as the Fillmore West in 1968, turning it into the most important rock venue on the West Coast. The psychedelic posters advertising shows at the Fillmore became collectible art. The light shows that accompanied the music were pioneering visual experiences. Graham understood that a rock concert could be more than entertainment. It could be transcendence. In February of 1970, Ralph Gleason, the jazz critic who had championed the San Francisco sound, filmed a concert at the Family Dog Ballroom that captured the scene at its peak. Santana, the Grateful Dead, and Jefferson Airplane all played on the same bill, and the night ended with an all-star jam featuring members of all 3 bands. Watching that footage now, you can see the community that existed among these musicians. They weren't competitors. They were neighbours, friends, fellow travellers on a strange and beautiful journey. As the decade progressed, the music scene continued to evolve. The late 70s saw something entirely new emerge from San Francisco: punk rock. The Mabuhay Gardens, a Filipino restaurant and nightclub in North Beach, became the CBGB of the West Coast. Bands like the Dead Kennedys and the Avengers rejected everything the hippie generation had stood for. Their music was fast, angry, confrontational. They looked at the idealism of the 60s and saw only failure and hypocrisy. The Dead Kennedys' lead singer, Jello Biafra, had a particular genius for provocation. The band's name itself was designed to shock. Their songs attacked politicians, corporations, the California establishment, and sometimes the very audience listening to them. It was a different kind of rebellion than what had come before, but it was unmistakably San Franciscan in its irreverence and ambition. Perhaps the most symbolically important musical event of the decade came on New Year's Eve, 1978. The Grateful Dead played the final show at Winterland, Bill Graham's other legendary venue. The concert stretched through the night, the Dead playing set after set as if reluctant to let go. The Blues Brothers opened the show. After their set, they retired to Jefferson Airplane's mansion at 2400 Fulton for an after-party that reportedly featured the largest pile of cocaine anyone present had ever seen. When the sun rose on January 1st, 1979, an era had ended. But the music that San Francisco had given to the world continued to echo. The songs written in those Victorian houses, recorded in those makeshift studios, performed on those legendary stages, They didn't disappear when the venues closed. They became part of the American songbook, part of our collective memory, part of who we are. While rock and roll dominated the cultural conversation about San Francisco in the 70s, another musical tradition was quietly being destroyed. And this story, the story of the Fillmore district's jazz scene, is one of the great tragedies of the decade. To understand what was lost, you have to go back to the 1940s. During World War II, African Americans from across the country came to San Francisco to work in the shipyards. They needed places to live, and in a segregated city, their options were limited. Many of them settled in the Fillmore district, a neighborhood that had been home to Japanese Americans until President Roosevelt signed the order that sent them to internment camps. The black community that grew in the Fillmore was extraordinary. By the late 40s and 50s, the neighborhood had earned the nickname the Harlem of the West. Clubs lined both sides of Fillmore Street, each one offering a different flavor of jazz, blues, and rhythm and blues. You could start your evening at one end of the strip and work your way down, hearing different bands, different styles, the music flowing from open doors into the cool San Francisco night. The most legendary of these clubs was Jimbo's Bop City. It was an after-hours joint, the kind of place that didn't really get going until the regular clubs closed at 2 in the morning. Jimbo's would stay open until 6, sometimes later, and the musicians who played there were giants. Billie Holiday, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, Miles Davis. They would finish their paid gigs at the fancy downtown hotels and then come to the Fillmore to really play, to stretch out, to jam with their peers without worrying about what the audience wanted to hear. The Fillmore wasn't just about music. It was a complete community. Black-owned businesses lined the streets. There were restaurants and barbershops, churches and social clubs. Families put down roots. Children grew up knowing their neighbors, knowing the merchants, feeling a sense of belonging that was hard to find for black Americans in most of the country. By the early 1970s, the African American population of San Francisco reached its peak, about 13% of the city's total population. Much of that community was concentrated in the Fillmore and in Bayview Hunters Point. It was a vibrant, vital presence in the life of the city, and then came urban renewal. The city government looked at the Fillmore and saw blight. They saw old Victorian houses in need of repair. They saw density and crowding. What they didn't see, or chose not to see, was a community. They called their plan redevelopment. The people who lived through it called it Negro removal. The A2 redevelopment project, which began in 1966 and continued through the end of the 70s, was devastating. It covered about 70 city blocks. When it was finished, up to 13,500 residents had been displaced. Over 4,500 households were destroyed. 5,000 units of low-rent housing were demolished. The city promised that the residents could return after the rebuilding. This promise was a lie. The new housing that replaced the old was far more expensive. The people who had built their lives in the Fillmore found themselves scattered across the Bay Area, their community shattered, their networks of mutual support broken, and the jazz clubs closed. One by one, they disappeared. Jimbo's Bop City had already closed its doors in 1965, a casualty of changing times and changing tastes. But the clubs that remained, the venues that had kept the flame alive, they couldn't survive the destruction of their neighborhood. When you demolish the houses around a nightclub, you demolish its audience. Terry Hilliard was a young bass player in those days, playing with house bands at Fillmore venues. Years later, he would reflect on what was lost. The Fillmore was a place where talent could be developed, he said. Whether it be music, art, dancing, or whatever it was a place where you could express yourself and be accepted by others, and you had an audience. That audience was gone now. The musicians who had made their living in the Fillmore faced impossible choices. Some left San Francisco entirely, heading to New York or Los Angeles or wherever they could find work. Some stayed but abandoned music, taking day jobs to survive. The infrastructure that had supported a musical community for decades was simply gone. Mary Stallings, a jazz vocalist who had performed at the Fillmore Club, still lives in San Francisco, but she says that going back to the old neighborhood breaks her heart. "I was trying to explain that in another interview," she once said, "and I didn't get very far because I cried like a baby. I missed the community feeling, the feeling of family." The destruction of the Fillmore's black community is one of the hidden stories of 1970s San Francisco. While the city gained a reputation for tolerance and progressive values, it was simultaneously destroying one of its most vibrant neighborhoods. The contradiction is difficult to reconcile, but it was very real. Today, if you walk down Fillmore Street, you'll find expensive boutiques and trendy restaurants. There are murals commemorating the jazz era, markers noting where famous clubs once stood. The Fillmore Jazz Festival is held every July, and a few venues try to keep the tradition alive. But less than 6% of San Francisco's population is black now, half of what it was at its peak. The community that created the Harlem of the West has largely left the city. The music lives on in recordings. You can still hear Billie Holiday singing at Jimbo's, still hear the late-night jam sessions that went until dawn. But the community that created that music, nurtured it, supported it, that community exists now only in memory. It's a loss that San Francisco has never fully reckoned with, a wound that has never fully healed. The 1970s in San Francisco weren't just about music and social change. They were also about fear, a kind of fear that seeped into everyday life, that made people look over their shoulders, that turned ordinary activities like walking home at night into calculated risks. The source of that fear had a name. Actually, it had several names, because San Francisco in the 70s was terrorized by not one but multiple serial killers, their crimes overlapping in time, creating an atmosphere of dread that's difficult to imagine now. The most famous was the Zodiac. He had started killing in the late 60s, targeting young couples in secluded areas around the Bay. But his presence loomed over the entire decade that followed. The Zodiac didn't just kill, he communicated. He sent letters to newspapers, taunting the police, threatening to kill more, encoding his messages in ciphers that he dared the public to solve. The San Francisco Chronicle was his primary correspondent. The letters would arrive with their strange symbols and their boastful claims. He took credit for murders that may or may not have been his. He promised to kill children on school buses. He kept the city in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing when or where he might strike again. Inspector Dave Toschi of the San Francisco Police Department became the face of the investigation. He pursued the Zodiac case with an obsession that would consume years of his life. But the killer was always one step ahead. He seemed to know police procedures, to anticipate their moves, to delight in their frustration. In 1971, Clint Eastwood made a movie called Dirty Harry. The villain, Scorpio, was directly inspired by the Zodiac, and the movie was being filmed in San Francisco while the real killer was still at large. It was a strange moment, art imitating a life that was still unfolding. The Zodiac's last confirmed letter arrived in 1974. Then he simply stopped communicating. No arrest was ever made. The case remains officially unsolved to this day. Theories abound about who he was. Suspects have been named and investigated and cleared. But we still don't know for certain who terrorized the Bay Area in those years. And yet, as frightening as the Zodiac was, he wasn't even the most prolific killer operating in San Francisco during this period. That grim distinction may belong to a group of men who came to be known as the Zebra Killers. Between October of 1973 and April of 1974, a series of random shootings terrorized the city. The victims were shot on the street without warning, without provocation. They were chosen, it seemed, for one reason. They were white. The killers, 4 black men associated with a fringe religious group called the Death Angels, believed they were engaged in a race war. The attacks were brutal in their randomness. You could be walking home from work, waiting for a bus, leaving a store, and suddenly someone would approach and open fire. 15 people were killed, 8 more were wounded. Among the survivors was a young man named Art Agnos, who would later become the mayor of San Francisco. The police called the case Zebra because they assigned the Z radio frequency exclusively to the task force investigating the murders. The name stuck in the public imagination. The city was paralyzed with fear. Some residents stopped going out at night entirely. In April of 1974, the police instituted a controversial stop-and-search program. Young black men fitting a general description were stopped and questioned throughout the city. The program was denounced as racist and was eventually ended by a court order. But by then, a witness had come forward and arrests were made. 4 men were eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Some criminologists believe the Death Angels may have killed as many as 73 victims throughout California since 1970. If true, that would make them among the most prolific serial killers in American history. But we'll never know for certain. the full extent of their crimes remains disputed. The Zodiac and Zebra cases dominated headlines, but they weren't the only sources of fear in 70s San Francisco. There were other killers, other crimes, other reasons to be afraid. The decade seemed to produce violence in quantities that defied explanation. The Chronicle reporter who covered many of these cases was a man named Duffy Jennings. Years later, he would write a memoir about his time as a crime reporter in 70s San Francisco. He called it Reporter's Notebook, and the subtitle captured the era perfectly: a San Francisco Chronicle journalist's diary of the shocking 70s. On any given day, Jennings might find himself writing about the Zodiac or Zebra, or some new horror that had emerged from the fog. The combination of fear and creative energy that defined the city in those years was unlike anything before or since. San Francisco was simultaneously one of the most dangerous places in America and one of the most vibrant. The same streets where killers hunted were the streets where rock stars performed and revolutionaries plotted and communities formed. It was all happening at once, in the same small city, under the same grey skies. The fear eventually subsided. The Zodiac stopped killing, or at least stopped being caught. The Zebra murders ended with the arrests, but the decade wasn't done producing horrors. The worst was yet to come, and unlike the serial killers who operated in shadows, what happened next would unfold in the full glare of publicity, with consequences that would shake the entire nation. On the evening of February 4th, 1974, a 19-year-old college student named Patricia Hearst was in her apartment near the University of California, Berkeley. She was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the legendary newspaper magnate, and the daughter of Randolph Hearst, who ran the San Francisco Examiner. In other words, she was American royalty, as close to aristocracy as this country produces. That night there was a knock at the door. When her fiancé opened it, armed men and women burst in. They beat him, they bound Patricia, they stuffed her into the trunk of a car and drove away into the night. The kidnappers called themselves the Symbionese Liberation Army, and their action would set in motion one of the strangest stories of the 1970s. The SLA was a small group, never more than about a dozen members, but they had already made their presence known. A few months earlier, they had assassinated Marcus Foster, the superintendent of Oakland schools, shooting him with cyanide-tipped bullets. They saw themselves as revolutionary soldiers, fighting against what they called the fascist state. Their seven-headed cobra symbol and their slogan, "Death to the fascist insect that preys upon the life of the people," were designed to inspire fear. The group was led by Donald DeFreeze, an escaped convict who had adopted the name Chinqui and styled himself General Field Marshal. The other members were mostly young white radicals who had been searching for a cause. They found one in DeFreeze's violent vision. At first, the Hearst kidnapping seemed like a straightforward extortion scheme. The SLA demanded the release of two of their members who were in prison for the Foster assassination. When that demand was refused, they changed tactics. They ordered the Hearst family to distribute free food to the poor of California. The People in Need program, as it was called, became a chaotic spectacle. The Hearsts put up millions of dollars to buy food that was distributed at locations around the Bay Area. But the distribution sites turned into riots. Food was thrown, people were injured, nothing went according to plan. The SLA declared the effort inadequate and demanded more. Then came the twist that nobody saw coming. In April of 1974, the SLA released an audio tape. On it, Patricia Hearst announced that she had joined her captors. She had taken a new name, Tanya, after a companion of Che Guevara. She denounced her family, her class, her entire previous life. She declared herself a revolutionary. 2 weeks later, surveillance cameras at a San Francisco bank captured an image that shocked America. Patricia Hearst, Tanya, was holding a machine gun during a bank robbery. She wasn't a hostage. She appeared to be a full participant. The newspaper heiress had become a revolutionary soldier. What had happened? Had she been brainwashed? Was she suffering from what would later be called Stockholm Syndrome, identifying with her captors out of psychological survival? Or had she genuinely converted to the cause, seeing in the SLA something that her privileged life had been missing? The questions would be debated for years. But in the moment, the practical reality was that one of America's most famous young women was on the run with a band of armed revolutionaries. The FBI launched a massive manhunt. The SLA became the most wanted organization in the country. In May of 1974, police surrounded an SLA safe house in Los Angeles. In the ensuing gun battle, the building caught fire. 6 members of the group, including Donald DeFreeze, died in the flames. Patricia Hearst wasn't there. She watched the building burn on live television. For more than a year after that, Hearst remained underground. She moved from safe house to safe house, protected by what remained of the SLA and other radical sympathizers. She participated in another bank robbery, during which a bystander was killed. She had crossed a line from which there was no easy return. In September of 1975, the FBI finally caught up with her. She was arrested in San Francisco, gaunt and disoriented, a shadow of the young woman who had been kidnapped 19 months earlier. When asked her occupation during booking, she said, "Urban guerrilla." The trial that followed was a national sensation. Hearst's lawyers argued that she had been tortured, brainwashed, conditioned to obey her captors through systematic abuse. They called it coercive persuasion. The prosecution argued that she had been a willing participant, that her revolutionary conversion was genuine. The jury convicted her of bank robbery. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison. President Carter commuted her sentence in 1979, after she'd served less than 2 years. President Clinton granted her a full pardon in 2001. The Patty Hearst case captured something essential about 1970s America. The boundaries between victim and perpetrator, between loyalty and betrayal, between who we are and who we might become under extreme circumstances, all of these seemed to dissolve in her story. She was wealthy beyond imagination, yet she ended up living in squalid safe houses. She was raised in privilege, yet she found herself clutching a machine gun in a bank. She was in some ways the perfect symbol of a decade when nothing was stable, nothing was certain, nothing could be taken for granted. Years later, Hearst would live a quiet life of suburban respectability. She married her bodyguard, raised children, showed dogs at Westminster. The revolutionary Tanya faded into history. But the questions her case raised, about identity, about free will, about what we're capable of when pushed to our limits, those questions never quite went away. While terror stalked the streets and revolutionaries kidnapped heiresses, something else was happening in San Francisco. Something that would prove, in the long run, far more transformative than any of the decade's violence. A neighborhood was being reborn, and with it, a community was finding its voice. The Castro District in the early 70s was a working-class Irish neighborhood in decline. The young families who had once lived there were moving to the suburbs. Storefronts stood empty. Houses could be bought cheaply. It was, in other words, the perfect place for a community of outsiders to put down roots. Gay men had been moving to San Francisco for decades, drawn by the city's reputation for tolerance. But they had never had a neighborhood to call their own. They had lived in shadows, meeting in secret bars, always aware that the police could raid at any moment, that their jobs and families could be destroyed if they were discovered. The Castro changed that. Gay men started buying houses there, opening businesses, creating something that hadn't existed before. A visible, unashamed, thriving gay community. By the late 70s, the New York Times estimated that San Francisco's gay population was between 100,000 and 200,000 out of a total population of 750,000. Many of them lived in or near the Castro. At the center of this transformation was a man named Harvey Milk. He had arrived in San Francisco in 1972, a 42-year-old former Wall Street analyst who had grown tired of hiding who he was. With his partner Scott Smith, he opened a camera shop on Castro Street, right in the heart of the neighborhood. Castro Camera quickly became more than a business. It became a community center, a gathering place, a headquarters for something larger. Harvey Milk had found his calling. Milk was a natural politician, but he was nothing like the politician San Francisco was used to. He was loud where they were cautious. He was theatrical where they were restrained. He organized a boycott of Coors Beer, working with the Teamsters Union to force the company to change its anti-gay and anti-union policies. The boycott succeeded, and Milk learned a crucial lesson. Gay people had economic power, and they could use it. He ran for the Board of Supervisors in 1973, 1975, and 1976, losing each time but building his base with every campaign. He cut his hair, swore off marijuana, and learned to speak the language of coalition politics. He won the support of firefighters and construction workers, people who might have seemed unlikely allies but who responded to his energy and his vision. In 1977, the rules changed. San Francisco switched from citywide elections for supervisor to district elections. This meant that candidates would be elected by their own neighborhoods rather than by the city as a whole. For the Castro, it meant that the community could finally elect one of its own. Harvey Milk won handily. He became one of the first openly gay elected officials in American history, and certainly the most prominent. The night of his victory, thousands of people filled Castro Street to celebrate. It felt like the beginning of a new era. And in many ways, it was. Milk used his platform to fight for gay rights, but also for broader progressive causes. He believed that the struggle for gay liberation was connected to every other struggle for justice. He marched with striking workers. He advocated for the elderly and the disabled. He pushed for reforms that would benefit the entire city, but he also faced enemies. Anita Bryant, the former beauty queen turned conservative crusader, was leading a national campaign against gay rights. She had successfully repealed a gay rights ordinance in Miami, and copycat efforts were spreading across the country. In California, a state senator named John Briggs proposed Proposition 6, which would have banned gay people from teaching in public schools. The fight against the Briggs initiative became Milk's defining battle. He travelled the state debating Briggs, making the case that gay people were not threats to children, but members of families, neighbours, fellow citizens. The proposition was defeated in November of 1978, a stunning victory that showed the growing political power of the gay community. But the victories came with violence. In June of 1977, a young gay man named Robert Hillsborough was stabbed to death in San Francisco while his attackers chanted slurs. The murder galvanized the community. The following Gay Pride parade drew 250,000 people, the largest attendance at any Pride event up to that point. Milk knew that he was a target. He received death threats regularly. He made audio recordings to be released in the event of his assassination, urging the community to continue the fight without him. He understood that his visibility made him vulnerable, but he refused to hide. "If a bullet should enter my brain," he said on one of those recordings, "let that bullet destroy every closet door." The Castro of the late 70s was a remarkable place. Rainbow flags flew from Victorian houses. Same-sex couples walked hand in hand down the street, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Businesses catered openly to gay customers. A community that had been invisible for all of American history was suddenly, defiantly visible. But the story of the Castro in the 70s cannot be separated from the story of San Francisco in the 70s. The same city that was birthing this community of liberation was also being terrorized by killers, transfixed by kidnappings, and about to confront the darkest chapter in its modern history. The decade was building towards something, though no one knew quite what. Among the many remarkable figures who walked the streets of 1970s San Francisco, none would prove more consequential or more destructive than a preacher named Jim Jones. When Jones first arrived in San Francisco, he seemed like exactly what the city needed. He preached racial equality at a time when that message still faced resistance. His congregation, the People's Temple, was genuinely integrated, black and white worshipping together, working together, living together. He spoke of social justice, of caring for the poor, of building a community that lived its values. His church, headquartered in an old building at 1859 Geary Boulevard, became a force in San Francisco politics. Jones could deliver volunteers by the hundreds for political campaigns. When George Moscone ran for mayor in 1975, Jones's people worked tirelessly for his campaign. When Moscone won, narrowly, Jones collected on the debt. He was appointed chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission. The political establishment embraced him. Willie Brown, who would later become mayor himself, called Jones a rare human being who cares about people. Harvey Milk attended People's Temple events and wrote letters praising Jones. When critics began raising questions about the temple, Milk defended Jones to President Carter himself, calling the accusations bold-faced lies. How could so many smart people be so wrong about one man? The answer lies in what Jones showed them versus what he hid. What he showed them was impressive. The temple ran programs for the elderly and the homeless. It provided services that the city and state weren't providing. It welcomed people who'd been rejected everywhere else. For African Americans in particular, Jones offered something rare. A white preacher who seemed to genuinely believe in equality, who put his money and his church where his mouth was. What he hid was monstrous. Behind closed doors, Jones was a tyrant. He demanded absolute loyalty. He used psychological manipulation, public humiliation, and physical punishment to control his followers. He claimed to be able to raise the dead, to heal the sick, to read minds. He staged fake healings and fake miracles to convince doubters. He preyed sexually on both men and women in his congregation. Former members began to defect and tell their stories. They described beatings, forced labor, financial exploitation. They said that Jones kept members in line through fear, that he rehearsed mass suicides, that he was increasingly paranoid and unhinged. But for a long time, these accounts were dismissed. Jones was too connected, too useful to too many powerful people. In 1974, the People's Temple had leased land in the South American country of Guyana. Jones called the settlement they built there the People's Temple Agricultural Project. It came to be known as Jonestown. It was supposed to be a socialist utopia, a place where temple members could escape the racism and capitalism of America and build a new society from scratch. By 1977, as the investigations into his practices intensified, Jones began moving his followers to Guyana. Hundreds of people, many of them elderly, many of them children, left their lives in California behind and relocated to a jungle clearing thousands of miles from home. Conditions in Jonestown were harsh. The settlement was overcrowded, food was limited, medical care was inadequate. Jones, increasingly addicted to drugs and increasingly paranoid, controlled every aspect of his followers' lives. He broadcast his rambling sermons over loudspeakers at all hours. He conducted mock suicide drills, what he called white nights, to test his followers' loyalty. Families back in the United States grew worried. They organized as the concerned relatives and began lobbying the government to investigate. Their pleas eventually reached Congressman Leo Ryan of California, who represented many of the temple members. In November of 1978, Ryan decided to travel to Guyana and see for himself what was happening in Jonestown. Ryan arrived with a delegation that included journalists, staffers, and members of concerned relatives. At first, the visit seemed to go well. Temple members performed for the visitors, sang songs, expressed happiness with their life in the jungle. But behind the scenes, some members were slipping notes to the journalists begging to leave. On November 18, 1978, as Ryan's group prepared to leave with about 15 defectors, the situation collapsed. At the airstrip in Port Kaituma, 6 miles from Jonestown, gunmen from the temple opened fire. Ryan was killed. So were 3 journalists and 1 of the defectors. Others were wounded, including a young staff member named Jackie Spire, who had survived to become a congresswoman herself. But the killing at the airstrip was only the beginning. Back in Jonestown, Jones gathered his followers in the Central Pavilion. He told them that the congressman was dead, that the American military would soon arrive to torture them and their children. He said there was only one way out. The vats of grape-flavoured drink laced with cyanide had already been prepared. What happened next took about 40 minutes. Parents fed the poison to their children first, squirting it into the mouths of babies with syringes. Then the adults drank. Some resisted and were injected by guards. Jones himself died of a gunshot wound, probably self-inflicted. When it was over, 909 people were dead, including more than 300 children. It was the largest loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until September 11, 2001. In San Francisco, the news arrived like a bomb. Jones had been a fixture of the political scene. He had been welcomed into the homes of the powerful. He had been trusted with public responsibilities. And now he had led 900 people to their deaths. The temple's headquarters on Geary Boulevard was besieged by media. Rumors spread that surviving temple members in San Francisco were organizing hit squads to target critics. Fear and confusion reigned. The questions that Jonestown raised have never been fully answered. How did Jones maintain his hold over so many people for so long? Why did the warning signs go unheeded? What responsibility did the politicians who had embraced him bear for what happened? The tragedy cast a shadow over everything that came after. Just 9 days later, that shadow would deepen into something even darker. November of 1978 was not yet over. San Francisco was still reeling from Jonestown when the next blow fell. This one came not from a jungle thousands of miles away, but from inside City Hall itself. Dan White was a supervisor, elected at the same time as Harvey Milk in that watershed election of 1977. He was everything Milk was not: a former police officer and firefighter, a military veteran, a man of conservative values who represented the working-class Irish neighbourhood of Potrero Hill. Yet the two had started out as collegial, even friendly. They appeared on talk shows together. Milk attended the christening of White's son. But tensions grew. White was struggling financially, unable to support his family on a supervisor's salary. He was increasingly isolated on the board, often the lone vote against progressive measures. He resigned from his seat in November, citing financial pressures. Then he changed his mind. He asked Mayor Moscone to reappoint him. At first, Moscone seemed willing, but Milk and others lobbied against the reappointment. They wanted to replace White with someone more sympathetic to their agenda. Moscone decided to go along with them. On the morning of November the 27th, 1978, Dan White came to City Hall through a basement window, avoiding the metal detectors. He was carrying a police revolver and extra ammunition. First, he went to see Mayor Moscone. The two men spoke briefly, then White drew his gun. He shot Moscone in the arm and shoulder. As the mayor fell behind his desk, White stood over him and fired 2 more shots into his head at close range. White reloaded his gun and walked across City Hall to Harvey Milk's office. "Harvey, can I see you for a minute?" he asked. Milk followed White into his former office. White fired 5 shots. Like Moscone, Milk was finished with 2 shots to the head at close range. It was an execution. White left City Hall and turned himself into a former colleague at a nearby police station. "I shot the mayor and Harvey," he said. The news spread through San Francisco like a shockwave. For the gay community, still celebrating the defeat of the Briggs Initiative, still mourning Jonestown, it was almost too much to bear. The man who had told them to come out of their closets, who had given them hope that the world could change, was dead. That evening, 40,000 people gathered in the Castro holding candles. They marched in silence to City Hall, a river of light flowing through the dark streets. It was one of the most powerful demonstrations of collective grief San Francisco had ever seen. Dianne Feinstein, the president of the Board of Supervisors, announced the deaths from City Hall's steps. "Both Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed," she said, her voice breaking. She became acting mayor, then mayor. The politics of San Francisco had changed forever. What came next only deepened the community's rage. Dan White was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But when the case went to trial, his lawyers argued something remarkable, that White had been suffering from depression so severe that he couldn't have premeditated the killings. As evidence of his deteriorated mental state, they pointed to his diet. He had been eating junk food, they said, excessive amounts of Twinkies and Coca-Cola. The sugar had affected his brain chemistry. The press called it the Twinkie defense. It became a symbol of everything wrong with the criminal justice system. How could a jury believe that eating snack cakes excused political assassination? But believe it they did, or at least they bought enough of the diminished capacity argument to convict White not of murder, but of voluntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 7 years and 8 months. With time off for good behaviour, he could be out in 5. When the verdict was announced on May 21st, 1979, the gay community's grief turned to fury. Thousands marched on City Hall. This time there was no silent vigil. Windows were smashed, police cars were burned. The White Night riots, as they came to be called, raged through the Civic Center. The police, enraged by the attack on their building and their vehicles, retaliated. They swept into the Castro and began beating anyone they found. Gay bars were raided. People were pulled into the street and assaulted. It was one of the darkest nights in the neighborhood's history. Dan White served 5 years. He was released in 1984. Less than 2 years later, he committed suicide. The murders of Moscone and Milk, coming so soon after Jonestown, seemed to crystallize something about 1970s San Francisco. The decade that had promised liberation, that had birthed new movements and new music and new ways of living, had ended in blood. The optimism of the 60s, already battered by the Haight's decline and the city's serial killers, was finally definitively over. But endings are also beginnings, and from the ashes of November 1978, something new would rise. How does a city recover from a decade like that? How do you process the accumulated traumas of serial killers and cult massacres, of assassinations and riots, of watching neighborhoods die and communities shatter? San Francisco did what it had always done. It kept living. It kept creating. It kept pushing forward, not despite its wounds, but through them. The punk rock scene that had been gestating in North Beach became a kind of therapy for the city. The dead Kennedys screamed their anger about politicians and police and the California establishment. Their music wasn't pretty, but it was honest. It acknowledged that the world was broken, that the promises of the 60s had failed, that rage was an appropriate response to what had happened. On New Year's Eve 1978, just weeks after the City Hall assassinations, the Grateful Dead closed the Winterland Arena for good. The concert stretched through the night, the band playing until dawn, as if reluctant to let the decade end. The Blues Brothers opened the show. Bill Graham served breakfast to the audience as the sun rose. It was a farewell to an era, a last look back before turning to face whatever came next. Dianne Feinstein, who had announced the deaths of Moscone and Milk, became the city's first female mayor. She would lead San Francisco through the transition from the 70s to the 80s, from the era of counterculture to the era of AIDS, from the old San Francisco to something new. The gay community, devastated by Milk's murder, didn't retreat. They organized. They ran for office. They built institutions that would fight for their rights long after the grief had faded. The lesson they took from Milk's death was the lesson he had taught in life. Visibility was power, and the only way forward was to keep coming out, keep demanding recognition, keep refusing to disappear. The seeds of the technology revolution were being planted, though no one knew it yet. Silicon Valley, just down the peninsula, was beginning its transformation from orchards to computer labs. The Homebrew Computer Club, where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had shown off early Apple prototypes, was meeting in the mid-70s. The next era of San Francisco's economy was already taking shape, waiting for its moment. What the 70s taught San Francisco was resilience. The city had faced horrors that would have broken many places. It had watched its beloved Haight-Ashbury descend into darkness. It had been terrorized by killers who were never caught. It had seen its leaders murdered in their offices. It had witnessed the largest mass suicide in American history, committed by people who had lived in its neighborhoods, and it had survived. Not unchanged, certainly. You can't go through what San Francisco went through in the 70s and remain the same. But the spirit of the city, that strange combination of idealism and pragmatism, of creativity and community, of welcoming the different and the strange, that spirit endured. The hate eventually recovered, sort of. It became a tourist attraction, a place where visitors could buy tie-dyed t-shirts and peer into head shops, playing at being hippies for an afternoon. The real counterculture energy had moved on, but the memory remained. The Castro only grew stronger. The 80s would bring new challenges, catastrophic ones, as AIDS devastated the community. But the political power that had been built in the 70s, the visibility that Milk had fought and died for, those things provided a foundation for survival. The music continued to evolve. San Francisco never stopped being a city of sound, whether it was the legacy acts still touring decades later, or the new bands emerging from garages and clubs. And the fog continued to roll in from the bay, as it had for centuries, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath it. So what do we take from this journey through 1970s San Francisco? What lessons does this tumultuous decade hold for us, all these years later? Perhaps the first lesson is about the price of dreams. The people who flocked to the hate in the 60s genuinely believed they were building a new world. Their failure wasn't inevitable. It was the result of real forces, real pressures, real mistakes. Understanding what went wrong doesn't mean dismissing what they tried to do. It means taking seriously both their vision and its collapse. The second lesson is about vigilance. Jim Jones fooled a lot of smart, well-intentioned people. He did it by telling them what they wanted to hear, by wrapping his manipulation in the language of justice and equality. The lesson isn't that we should distrust everyone who speaks of changing the world. It's that we should look carefully at the gap between what people say and what they do, between the public face and the private reality. The third lesson is about courage. Harvey Milk knew he was a target. He made recordings to be played after his assassination. And he kept going anyway, kept being visible, kept demanding that others come out of their closets and stand in the light. His courage didn't prevent his death, but it did change the world. The fourth lesson is about community. The destruction of the Fillmore shows what happens when communities are torn apart by forces beyond their control. The rise of the Castro shows what's possible when communities come together and fight for their survival. Both stories are part of the same decade, the same city, the same human capacity for building and destroying, and the final lesson perhaps is about San Francisco itself. This strange, beautiful city on its hills by the bay has always been a place where people come to reinvent themselves, to escape their pasts, to try things that couldn't be tried anywhere else. Sometimes those experiments succeed magnificently. Sometimes they fail catastrophically. Usually they do both at once. The 1970s were a decade of extremes. They gave us some of the greatest rock music ever recorded and some of the worst violence in American history. They saw communities rise and communities fall. They produced heroes and monsters, often in the same neighborhoods, sometimes in the same buildings. We remember the 70s selectively now. We remember the music. We remember the fashion, those wide lapels and bell-bottoms. We remember the cultural shifts, the loosening of old restrictions. We don't always remember the fear, the violence, the darkness that ran through those years like a fault line through the California earth. But the people who lived through it remember. They remember what it felt like to walk those streets, uncertain whether a serial killer might be watching. They remember the shock of turning on the television and seeing Patty Hearst with a machine gun. They remember the candlelight vigil that wound its way to City Hall and the riot that followed the verdict. San Francisco today is a different city in many ways, but it's also the same city, built on the same hills, shrouded in the same fog, home to the same dreams and the same dangers. And now, dear friends, I hope you found this journey through time as fascinating as I found it to tell. If you enjoyed this story, please do subscribe and leave a like. It helps more than you know. Let me know in the comments what other historical journeys you'd like to take together. For now, rest well. Let the fog of the past settle around you like a blanket. Let the music play softly in your memory. And when you dream tonight, perhaps you'll dream of San Francisco, that city of dreams and nightmares, of love and loss, of everything that was and everything that might have been. Good night, dear friends. Until next time.